Hey everybody, this is Timothy here. So I've been drafting Shadows over Innistrad a lot, and I actually made a video recently about a couple strategies you can use to improve your game, or a couple tips you can keep in mind when drafting Shadows over Innistrad. Here I want to talk about a couple cards that I've noticed are being completely overlooked in Shadows over Innistrad drafts, and I've been using them to great effect. They're the type of cards that you're never super happy opening. They're the type of cards you're never going to first pick, but they are the type of cards that get overlooked and passed towards the end of packs, and they actually work a lot better than people give them credit for. So if you're finding trouble looking for the niche that you really want to play, I suggest trying these cards out instead of just passing them along. They look like they may not be great, but I'll talk about why I think each of them is worthwhile. Also, I want to point out that I made a list in my last video of all of the cards I consider absolutely 100% unplayable in Shadows over Innistrad, and while some people disagree with a couple of those cards, I do stand firmly by that list. It was about 9 cards, 4 sideboard cards, cards that absolutely should not make your deck. None of those cards are on this list. These cards are a little less narrow, and those cards on the unplayable list are very, very bad, I should say. So no absolutely bad cards on here, just cards that I think people don't rate as highly as I do. Now, moving into the first one, I'm going to talk about something I have a personal bias towards, and that's a card like Essence Flux. I'm a huge fan of blinking effects, especially very, very cheap ones. Now, I think the problem with Essence Flux that people see is they see the word spirit on there, and they assume you have to be spirit tribal to make the most of this, that if you're not getting the 1/1 counter or something like this, it's not a particularly good card. Now, I will admit, Essence Flux is a little narrow since it can't blink your opponent's creatures, it can only blink your own, but that Spirit Clause is really just a bonus, kind of like Otherworldly Journey or something to that effect. I think the base card here is actually really good. The idea is that you use it to blink out a creature, and in the most common case, rebuy an Enter the Battlefield trigger. Of course, like I said, it doesn't have to be a spirit, but the extra +1/+1 counter is actually really nice, especially considering most of the spirits in this set are flyers. It can really push your flyers over the edge and make them the biggest creature on board and a relevant threat. Just getting that extra ETB trigger is really nice too, and I think that's the best use of it, is to rebuy an ETB trigger. But I think the second most common use is to blank removal spells, and this is why I think Essence Flux is an underrated card. Most of the removal spells in this format, if not 90% of them, are targeted removal, and they're fairly expensive. They're fairly rare in a pack. Not rare, but they don't pop up as often. There's a little less removal in this set than there are in most sets, I believe. But Essence Flux just blanks a removal spell, and it does it for 1 mana. If you're ever able to hold up blue and Essence Flux, you kind of have safety from more expensive cards like Fiery Temper, Reduced to Ash, Rabid Bite, so on and so forth. Essence Flux will get you out of that. It can also bump off certain enchantments like Deadweight, Bound by Moonsilver, Sleep Paralysis, so on and so forth. It's very, very good if your opponent is playing a lot of removal, especially targeted removal. Now, that doesn't mean you should put Essence Flux in your main board all the time, because honestly, some decks just don't have a lot of removal. But if you have ETB triggers, you're playing spirits, or you come up against an opponent who has a lot of removal, I suggest taking an Essence Flux and determining whether or not you leave it in the sideboard or you put it in your main deck. Sometimes it's good in the main deck, sometimes it's good to come out of the sideboard. A couple other notes here. One thing I've done that's really nice is using Essence Flux to flip a card back onto its front side. A lot of transform cards you don't really want to do this with because the backside is better, i.e. Kindly Stranger is stronger on the backside, but if you can flip it and destroy a creature and then use a card like Essence Flux to blink it out, it comes back in on its face side, meaning you can activate it again and blow another creature up. I can't think of too many other creatures you'd want to do this with. One that comes to mind is maybe Duskwatch Recruiter, since its front side is often better than this backside in the late game, but you do have the versatility to be able to do that. Unfortunately, you can't do it to your opponent's creatures. Like I said, you can't target your opponent's creatures with Essence Flux. But another couple things to keep in mind. Pack Guardian and Farbog Revenant. Also Spirits. Can you imagine using Essence Flux to blink out a Pack Guardian? It comes back as a 5/4 and you can rebuy the ability, get another wolf token for a land. Pretty insane if you ask me. Farbog Revenant, probably a little bit less exciting than Pack Guardian, but still an option. Making a 2/4 Skulk lifelink is pretty big deal and can lead to a lot of life swings over the course of a game. So Essence Flux, try taking it next time. See if it works out for you. Like I said, I have a personal bias towards blink effects, so maybe I like this card higher than most people will, but I think it's actually a serviceable combat trick and one that takes care of your opponent's combat tricks pretty well. Next card on this list, definitely not a slam dunk of a card, but Runaway Carriage is the type of card I like to consider a slam dunk when it comes to rarity. If you saw this card at common, there would be decks that just take a bunch of these and try to win with them, and if you saw it at rare, you'd be extremely disappointed anytime you see it, so I think uncommon is exactly where this card should be. Now, Runaway Carriage is a very strange card, and it's the type of card when you play it, someone might have to read it again because they've completely thrown it into the unplayable card category, and I think that's absolutely wrong. The best time to play this card is when you are the beatdown and you're looking to push in tons of damage. Uncaged Fury on Runaway Carriage is an absolute nightmare for your opponent, presenting a 12 damage point swing. See, the cool thing about Runaway Carriage is that your opponent knows you're going to lose it when you attack with it, so they're often not incentivized to block, especially since it has trample. They're usually willing to take the 5 damage and allow you to lose the card and take the card disadvantage over using one of their creatures to just chump it and take damage anyway. This leaves them wide open to cards like Uncaged Fury, and 12 damage is a huge amount, more than half your opponent's life total for 2 total cards. I think that's fair game. So also, Magmatic Chasm was in contention to be a card on this list for this presentation, and for good reason. Magmatic Chasm has performed very well in this format, allowing you to push in with big creatures. If you have cards like Runaway Carriage, Magmatic Chasm is a card that goes very well with it. Just allowing you to Lava Axe your opponent to the face with a 4-mana creature is pretty big deal, not to mention your other creatures are probably going to get in for the turn. Runaway Carriage also works fairly well in decks that care about your own creatures dying. For instance, Ulvenwald Mysteries gives you a clue token whenever a creature dies, and whenever you sacrifice a clue, you get a human. Well, Runaway Carriage is going to get a hit-in, and then it replaces itself with a clue token. I think that's pretty decent. Maybe not the best use of it, and to be honest, a green deck probably has other options besides Runaway Carriage, but it is something to consider. Likewise, I like to consider Runaway Carriage an upgrade to Wicker Witch when it comes to Delirium decks. I find it very confusing when people snatch up a Wicker Witch and run it in their green-black Delirium decks, but then they have a Runaway Carriage sitting in their sideboard. I really just don't understand it. Think about it. When you're playing Wicker Witch, what are you intending to do with it? You're intending to trade it with another creature and have it go to the graveyard, right? Well, what are you doing when you're playing Runaway Carriage? You want it to go to the graveyard in your Delirium decks, and if it trades with a creature, great. If it doesn't, you just got 5 points of damage in. Wicker Witch, it probably isn't going to get that much damage in unless your opponent's just scared of having your Delirium on. Runaway Carriage is a guaranteed artifact and creature in your graveyard when it attacks, plus probably a guaranteed big chunk of damage. I think it's just an upgrade to Wicker Witch in your Delirium deck. So next time you play it, try taking the Carriage over the Witch. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. And then finally, using Runaway Carriage alongside Instant Speed Sacrifice effects is a pretty neat little combo. Runaway Carriage does not sacrifice until the end of combat, so if you have open mana and you've attacked with it, you can respond to the trigger, even if it blocks, by using a card like Merciless Resolve or Pious Evangel or Indulgent Aristocrat, and sacrifice it, making value off of it before you just lose it. Use that card to your advantage to draw more cards or have some sort of sacrifice clause fulfilled. So oftentimes you can block with Runaway Carriage, eat a creature, and then sacrifice it to get the value off of it. I think Runaway Carriage is a lot better than it looks, and I think a lot of people are turned off by just sacking it, but if you can get a big chunk of damage out of it, I think it justifies its spot in your deck. I think the key place to play is Delirium decks over Wicker Witch, and I think people haven't really caught on to that yet, but that's just my opinion. It's a better card than Wicker Witch in those kinds of decks. Moving on, we have Vessel of Malignity, and I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the Vessel cycle. In general, the white one is the only one I really like to play. I'm not even a huge fan of the green one in Delirium decks. I know people really like to do that, and it is a solid card, but the blue one, the red one, the green one, even the black one here, not huge fans. But I have noticed there are times when Vessel of Malignity is actually really, really good. So, for instance, if you're up against an opponent with a lot of counter spells, the Vessel might be a card you want to board into. Obviously, you can only use it on your turn, and I think people forget about that sometimes. It is a sorcery speed activation, but if your opponent's sitting on cards that they have no way to cast, you're just going to eat them up out of their hand. Likewise, if your opponent is discarding a lot of cards as costs to activate their cards, for instance, they're playing cards like Lightning Axe or Pack Guardian, Vessel of Malignity is good against those decks. Either they're going to strip their own hand down very, very quickly by discarding cards, or they're going to be stuck in a position where they can't actually cast their cards, or they can't get full value off their cards because you've eaten up 2 of the cards in their hands. Keep in mind that the Vessel actually exiles. It doesn't force your opponent to discard, so it doesn't trigger their own madness or delirium costs. It actually stays away from that, so it's well designed in that department. Likewise, if you're playing kind of a tempo-based deck, Vessel of Malignity might be something you should consider next time. Imagine using Just a Win to bounce your opponent's creature on their end step, and then on the following turn you exile it from their hand with Vessel of Malignity. Bounce spells work great with discard spells. It's just something that usually works out, and the Vessel is a very nice little payoff for doing that. In the same kind of vein, Vessel of Malignity is good against opponents who have a lot of combat tricks, and you know those players. Some players like to load up on combat tricks where their decks are half creatures, half aim highs, and confront the unknowns, and so on and so forth. If your opponent's holding up a bunch of mana, and your opponent's got a bunch of cards in hand, or maybe they're down to that one card and you just really, really don't want to run into a combat trick, try the Vessel out. It'll strip the card from their hand, or they'll be forced to use it, and you'll know about it ahead of time so you can adjust your attacks. Vessel is often used, I think, in the first main phase just to make sure the coast is clear. And last little thing I'll mention, this is kind of like a neat little 2-card combo. Hermit of Natternulls. I could have picked probably any werewolf, but I think Hermit is the best one to use with Vessel. Like any of the Vessels, you can play it, and then on the following turn, if you have a werewolf, you can activate your Vessel instead of casting the card, and this will allow your werewolf to flip. So these Vessels are very nice alongside the werewolves, but Hermit of Natternulls is especially nice because when you activate the Vessel, if your opponent has some instants in hand, they're going to be incentivized to play it, or they're just going to straight up lose those cards. If they have some sort of draw spell, think about it. Is your opponent really going to just let you exile that card out of their hand? No, they're probably going to want to cast it. They're going to want to get the value off their card instead of just losing it. And if you have Hermit of the Natternulls, well, they're forced into a position where they're either going to lose their card or they're going to have you draw cards because of your Hermit. Very nice little synergy between the 2 cards. I'm not advocating for taking Vessels really, really highly, but if you have these 2 cards in your card pool, it's a nice little interaction to look at. Next up on this list is Senseless Rage, and I should point out a caveat here that I am not a particularly good aggro player. It's just not my play style of choice. But if it's what I get past in a draft, it's what I'll play. Senseless Rage is the type of card that when I was looking at spoilers and I saw the full set and I was reviewing cards, I thought this card would be absolutely terrible, and I've actually been very, very impressed with it lately, especially when I'm forced into aggro shells and I'm trying to build a quick deck that can win before my opponent really gets going. Stick this card on a turn 1 play or a turn 2 play, and you have a big creature that's beaten down very early in the game. Turn 1 Insolent Neonate or Indulgent Aristocrat into turn 2 Senseless Rage is huge life swings, not to mention your opponent's probably not going to be able to block for a while unless they're just chumping with their early turn plays. Insolent Neonate has Menace too, so like they really can't block for a while. Turn 2 Senseless Rage on a turn 1 creature is the nuts, and your opponent will take a lot of damage over the course of a game. I think if you can get at least 4 to 6 extra damage off Senseless Rage, it becomes very good, and if you can just use it to force your creature through or force some chump blocks, I think it justifies its place there as well. Obviously, Senseless Rage has Madness, so you can use it as a combat trick. And I think if your deck is positioned well enough that you can actually enable the Madness very consistently, I think it makes for a much, much better card than Rush of Adrenaline. I will admit I'm not a huge fan of Rush of Adrenaline in the first place. I don't think it's particularly good, but I know a lot of people like that sort of card. And while Senseless Rage doesn't have Trample, I think a permanent 2/2 for 1 extra mana is better than a temporary 2/1 with Trample. That's just my opinion. The Trample usually isn't too relevant on Rush of Adrenaline unless you're winning the game with it, but Senseless Rage makes your creature the biggest thing on the field for a number of consecutive turns when you play it early on that I think it's enough better than Rush of Adrenaline that I would just play that instead. Ravenous Bloodseeker gets my vote for the Wombo combo with Senseless Rage, since not only does it enable the card, but you can actually stick Senseless Rage on Ravenous Bloodseeker and it becomes a real powerhouse. Even if you're just casting it on Bloodseeker, that turns it into a 3/5, which is a creature that's not going to trade in combat with anything unless that creature has Death Touch, and then it threatens its own pump ability. The fact that you can go turn 2 Bloodseeker into turn 3 Senseless Rage, and then if your opponent's either going to lose a creature, or you can threaten to swing with 7 power on board with Bloodseeker's ability. It's pretty crazy, not to mention it's just a good enabler for Senseless Rage if you want to toss that on another creature instead. And then finally, I've mentioned this in a couple other videos, but there are a bunch of creatures in this format that really make aggro unexciting simply because they have big butts. You have a lot of 4 and 5 toughness creatures in this format, and once those creatures come down on board, it's very hard for the aggro deck to push in its damage from that point unless it backs it up with removal spells. Senseless Rage gets your creatures past these cards. Obviously, maybe not with the 1-power creatures, but if you're playing a lot of 2-power, 3-power creatures in your aggro deck, Senseless Rage is going to give you that extra little power boost to push through cards like Moldgraph Scavenger and Watcher of the Web, and it's just going to let you get that damage in, or it's going to force your opponent to block. Same thing I've said already when I first started talking about the card. It forces your opponent into a really awkward position. Last thing I'll say about Senseless Rage, it is an aura, so you still open yourself up to the 2-for-1. If your opponent's playing a tempo deck with a bunch of bounce spells, it gets a lot worse. But if you are really trying to push the early game in, it's a card I would definitely consider. And if you're already looking at playing Rush of Adrenaline, try playing Senseless Rage instead. I think it's an upgrade to that card. Final card I'll talk about here, Behind the Scenes. Now, this is the type of card I think gets overlooked, and I myself am not a huge fan of it. The times I play Behind the Scenes are when I'm drafting a complete crap pile of cards and I know that I'm going to have trouble winning the game. Behind the Scenes is kind of like a secondary plan rather than a completely first pickable build around. I would not pick Behind the Scenes and go all in on it, but it's the type of card that if your draft is not going well and you see this late in pack 1 or early in pack 2, you might be able to switch gears and draft around it so that you can make a winning strategy with what's left of the draft. It works really exceptionally well with creatures that are able to modulate their own power at instant speed. So for instance, Ember Eye Wolf is a 1-power creature, so when it has Skulk from Behind the Scenes, it can't be blocked except by 1 or 0-power creatures, which isn't a lot of things. And then, once your opponent's declared no blocks, you're able to pump it up at will and just try to force more damage into your opponent than you're going to be taking on the crackback. Same goes for cards like Quilled Wolf or Incite Rabble is another card that came to mind. These low-power creatures that can pump themselves work very well with the Skulk ability. It lets you swing in with them without fear of being blocked by anything super huge, and then it lets you pump before damage after your opponent's already declared no blocks because they can't block your Skull creature. I think these pump creatures, like the wolves here, are better than just using the pump on the card. Not to mention, you don't really want to force white mana into your black-red deck or your black-green deck, but it is an option. The alternative here is to actually take advantage of that second ability. And I think the best way to do this is a go wide strategy with tokens and mass pump effects or combat tricks. Call the Bloodline is a great example of this. It lets you flood the field with a bunch of 1/1 lifelinkers, and with Behind the Scenes, you give them Skulk, which means it's very unlikely that your opponent's going to be able to block them. In addition, you have the pump off behind the scenes to make your creatures bigger after combat, and the lifelink is going to provide you enough damage over the course of a game that you should be able to race your opponent and knock them out of the game before they knock you out. The life swings are just that big. Same goes for cards like Grotesque Mutation and Tenacity. You're able to swing in, use Skulk to back your creatures up and make sure they're not just being completely eaten up by your opponent's creatures, and then post blockers pre-combat you activate these instant speed spells to either pump your team or pump a little guy and give them lifelink, allowing you to win the race. Again, I'm not advocating for first picking behind the scenes. I don't think it's often a very good card, and it's definitely not the type of card you just throw in any black deck. But it is a build-around card, and it is the type of card that when you build around it, you can steal some games unexpectedly, and you can go over the top, or you can just fly underneath with a little team of dudes. I didn't put them on here, but anything that makes multiple bodies, especially spirit tokens. There are a lot of cards that make 1 or 2 extra spirit tokens for a single card. Anything that can make more than one body per card often combos pretty well with behind the scenes. So check it out next time you see it. If your draft is just completely derailed and you don't know what to do with it, try behind the scenes and a bunch of little guys. It might just get you there. So that's all I've got. A couple honorable mentions here. Magnifying Glass is a card that I think people have written off because they see the activation cost and they're like, oh, this is way too expensive. But I think people forget that it's actually just a ramp spell too and a mana sink, and it's a lot of what you ask for in a card. Somewhere to put your mana in the late game and something to ramp you into your late game early. I don't think it's a home run, and I definitely don't agree with it being an uncommon, but I think it's a decent card. And if you are playing a green-based deck with a lot of 5-drops, it's definitely a card you should consider looking at. Also, Invocation of Saint Traft and Fevered Visions were cards I left off this list because of their rarity mostly, and I think they're cards that get hated on a little bit in draft, but I think they're both very serviceable. I've won a lot of games with Invocation of Saint Traft, and I can often get 2 of them in my blue-white decks, simply because people think it's a bad card. And while it is an enchantment and opens you up for that whole 2-for-1 nonsense, 4 damage off of one card is quite a bit, and if you ever get 8 damage off of it, it is an absolute powerhouse. Once you've hit with it once and the Angel's gotten in, it's already justified its spot as a 3-mana 4 damage spell. And if you can repetitively do that or build your deck in such a way that you're able to win with it, it's a great card. Fevered Visions, I really like blue-red as a color combination in this set. I like the combination of small little prowess creatures and flyers, as well as tempo cards like bounce spells and burn spells. And Fevered Visions just keeps your hand loaded. Yes, it gives your opponent extra cards, but oftentimes that's a detriment, especially if they're taking that extra 2 damage per turn. Very nice little build-around card I'm super happy to pick in my blue-red deck, and also a card you can get rewarded with by being in that color combination. It's not the type of gold card that people splash for, so anyone who's not blue-red is not very likely to take the card. I left these cards off the list because there's actually not that much else to say about them than what I just said, so they're my honorable mentions. At any rate, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I know a lot of people probably disagree with these cards. Some of them seem kind of iffy, some of them maybe are even better than I'm giving them credit for, and it's kind of weird to make a video of cards that aren't very good, but cards that I think are underrated. So I'm curious what you think are some of the most underrated cards in Shadows over Innistrad. What have you been winning with that you're getting the last pick? What kind of cards are people passing in your draft, and what do they think is terrible that you're actually using to win the draft? Leave a comment below and tell me what card you think is the most underrated or underused card in Shadows over Innistrad. I'm very curious to find out. At any rate, like, comments, and subscribe. I'll be back with more videos soon, and I thank you again for watching. This is Timothy, and have a nice night.